I'm very pleased to be interviewing Billie Gold, who's Vice President, Programming and Research for CARA. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, you're welcome.
So let's start with your background. How did you get to where you are today?
Well, I was very, very lucky. In college, I actually was a psychology major, but I always knew that I wanted to go into the arts, whether it be music or television. And the thing that I was best at was math. And, my father was an accountant and my brother was an actuary. And everyone thought I would go down that path. But I wanted to use my numbers knowledge, but in a creative way, because I was always into, as I said, the arts. So when I was in college, I did internships at a number of media research companies, and I realized that is definitely what I wanted to go into. But I really wanted music at first, and MTV, I'm aging myself a little here, but MTV had just started, and I was working at the college radio station, and I thought, oh my God, I would do anything to work at MTV. And I was very lucky because my sister is also in the media business, and she knew the gentleman who had just got hired to head research at MTV, and he was looking for an assistant. And my sister was friends with his wife. And she goes, my sister would kill to work, and she's done internships, and she knows numbers, and she knows everything about music. So I was still taking my college finals, so I was very, very lucky. And I met the gentleman, and he said, when is your last final? And I said, Friday. He goes, well, can you start Monday? So I was there at the beginning of MTV. It was about 8 months old when I joined, but I was there. And, most of the music companies are on the West Coast. So when I was at MTV for 4.5 years, but when I was ready to move on, I just knew that, I couldn't go to the West Coast. I wasn't wanting to go there, so I ventured into television, and that's kind of how my career proliferated. And I was on the network side of the business, and now around 11 years ago, I moved to the agency side of the business. I started my career at MTV. I also worked at WNBC, which is Channel 4 on the local side, and I worked for ABC Television Network. For agencies, I worked at Bates. I worked there for about 4 years, and now I've been at CARA for 11 years. This month will be 11 years for me here.
Does research differ from the agency side to the network side? And if so, how so?
It definitely differs because in an agency, you have to know everything. You have to know the entire environment. You have to know the entire TV landscape, whether it be network, cable, syndication. So it's much more broad scope. When you work for a television network, you're more part of a single thing. It's more everything revolves around this one entity, and you're doing everything in your power to help build that brand up, find stories for that brand, and you really feel like you're more part of something. It's more an affinity. So, being on the network side, I always felt when I worked for a specific network, I lived and breathed that network. I knew everything about that network, and being research, I looked for stories, anything that would give us a one-up. But in the agency side, I need to be more of a generalist, and I really need to know the entire television landscape and really be up on current changes in the research environment, much more so, I think, than on the network side of the business. Because on the network side of the business, it's more about programming.
They say the television landscape is changing. From when you first started to now, how would you say the change has been progressing?
Rapidly. Honestly, I would say very rapidly because, again, I don't want to age myself, but when I was working, first coming out of college, cable was in its infancy, and not everyone had cable. As a matter of fact, I worked at MTV, but I couldn't get MTV at home because my Time Warner Cable, which was my carrier, didn't yet have MTV. Now there's hundreds and hundreds of cable networks out there. The average television household can get 120 cable networks on average. And a lot of the cable networks back when I was young were not young, but when I was coming out of college, they really were offsets of network shows. They carried repeats of shows. They didn't have that much original programming. MTV, of course, did at that time because it was an affinity of a network, but most of the other cable networks, they basically ran repeats of old off-air network shows, and now cable is becoming a real player. They're producing originals. Some of these originals are reaching parity with some mid-tier, lower-tier network shows. and the environment is just very different. I mean, kids today don't know the difference between watching cartoons on Nickelodeon or the Cartoon Channel, whether, or if they're watching it on the network. So it's really interesting. They've grown up with cable. To them, it's, Nickelodeon is the same channel as NBC, or History is the same channel, and that's what I've seen, such a rapid difference in change in just the landscape and how it's grown.
So would you say it's more of a question of programming as opposed to a network? Do you think that's fragmenting?
When you, when you say well, I definitely think it's programming as opposed to network, because the thing is, I think a program takes off and everyone looks for that program. I mean, I'm going to give an example to AMC. Originally, they just had Mad Men. And the thing is, they were known as a movie classics network, but Mad Men put them on the map and gave them an identity. I mean, now they have The Walking Dead, which is even far surpassed Mad Men in terms of viewership. But what happens is sometimes a show has a life of its own, and it creates basically an affinity for the network. I remember, years ago, Bravo was an arts network, and they introduced this new show called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and it put them on the map. It was a reality show, but it was about like decorating and food, and it put them on the map, and they realized, hey, we do good with this type of genre, and they grew from there. So I do think that years ago when cable started, it was really about the network. Each network had an identity and a brand, whereas now I think it's changed and it's about the programs, and it's creating the brand for the network.